121 comes about, without discernible logical rhyme. The studies have simply assumed that a 21 great knowingly fabricated estimates of risk based on personal recalls of lifetime exposure, the allegedly measure of which must be manifestly and absolutely illusory. Now, the claims of having measured lifetime exposure should be a first proof of fraudulent risk claims, but additional fallacies have further corrupted the epidemiologic studies. For instance, people with lung cancer are prone to exaggerate their recall of exposure more so than people who are disease-free. Also, it is well known that some non-smokers participants in epidemiologic studies lie when they claim to be non-smokers, and therefore their presence in the study will contaminate the results. The next slide, please. More than 2,000 independent risk factors for lung cancer are reported in the epidemiologic literature, as the chart here illustrates. At least we have some of those risks here. The size of this risk is much greater than the claimed 1.21 risk for ETS, as you can see. Yet all studies have failed to control credibly and sufficiently for those risk factors. Therefore, the claimed risks of ETS are doubly illusory because alternative explanations were not and could not be sufficiently analyzed and accounted for. The next slide, please. As an added dose of absurdity, the claimed ETS risks have been estimated on the basis of assumptions that cannot be sustained. The correct way to estimate risk is to find whether lung cancer is less frequent in people less exposed and more frequent in people more exposed. Instead, each ETS study has taken groups of non-smokers, all with lung cancer, and groups of non-smokers, all without lung cancer, and has compared the exposure recalls of the people with lung cancer versus the exposure recalls of those without lung cancer. Some studies have found that people without lung cancer recalled ETS exposures at a standardized rate of, say, 100, while those with lung cancer recalled exposure at a rate of 121. That's where the risk of 121 comes about, without discernible logical rhyme. The studies have simply assumed that a 21 greater recall of exposure represents a 21 excess risk of lung cancer, except that the absurdity of such reasoning becomes more clear when it's seen that it implies that an exposure of 121 is responsible for each of the lung cancers in groups of people with the disease, while people who remember only the slight lower exposure of 100 remain incredibly and totally immune from that cancer. The next slide, please. To add confusion, several studies also reported the reverse, namely that people with lung cancer recall less ETX exposure than those with the disease, therefore implying that ETS exposure protects against lung cancer. Indeed, a majority of studies of ETS exposure during childhood are consistent with the reduced risk of lung cancer, leading to the equally absurd implication that ETS exposure during childhood protects adults from lung cancer. Of the many published studies of ETS and lung cancer, some 70% did not report statistically significant differences of risk and therefore remain moot. Roughly 17% claim an increased risk and 13% imply a reduction of risk. Together, therefore, the studies of ETS have not produced consistent and reproducible results. Interesting enough, summaries of studies, such as the 2006 report of the United States Surgeon General that I just mentioned, discount and ignore studies that do not support risk, and of course give more weight to those that support risk elevation. Next slide, please. In summary, studies did not measure lifetime ETS doses. Studies falsely claim to have measured lifetime ETS exposures. No study can guarantee to have excluded participants who were or had been smokers. No study can exclude that the lung cancers observed might have been caused by other risk factors for lung cancer and not by ETS. Studies did not estimate risk comparing lung cancer frequencies against measures of ETS exposure. And finally, studies did not report results that are consistent and reproducible. All this should make it plainly obvious that the claimed lung cancer risk of ETS are a deceitful illusion. The abiding mystery is why so many have acquiesced for so many years, when it must have been manifest that the story of ETS risk is without any testable support. The alleged justification is that all has been for the higher goal of abolishing cigarettes and tobacco, even though bans have been only marginally effective in reducing the prevalence of smoking, while they certainly led to the most odious and socially unfair prohibitions. The mild and pleasurable addiction of nicotine and a rich black market continue to frustrate the abolitionist crusade. Abolition will not work. Instead, a humane and enlightened policy should seek to reduce the risk of smokers. A blueprint for less hazardous cigarettes was given 30 years ago by the National Cancer Institute in the United States, but was quickly suppressed by abolitionist intransigence. This relentless and uncaring obstruction has been responsible for untold millions of premature deaths that could have been spared worldwide if less hazardous cigarettes had been made available 30 years ago. The next slide, please. And yet now there is hope, because the blueprint of the National Cancer